Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi shir.
Shalom and welcome back to today's Daf Yomi, Shabbos Daf Yudches. We're 4 lines from the top. Says the Gemara, Man Tana, who is the Man Amar? Who is the author of our Mishnah that maintains that merely soaking ingredients together already have a din of a malacha, of a lisha, of a kneading together, kneading dough, K-N-E-A-D. So who is the shita that holds that merely introducing the ingredients to each other, merely pouring together the liquid with the solid, is considered to be the malacha of lisha? How do we see that in our Mishnah? Because the Mishnah tells us that according to Beis Shammai, one may not soak the various ingredients in the making of ink or dyes, for this constitutes a malacha, and one is meant to be shoves, his kelim, his utensils are meant to remain idle and not do malacha on Shabbos. So apparently the Tana of our Mishnah, who brings a machlekes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel in this regard, maintains that indeed soaking together ingredients which form together, which bind together into a glob, are considered to be lisha, even without manual kneading. Again, Mantana, who is the author, who is the Madamar of our Mishnah that holds Nesinas Mayim L'Diyoy, merely introducing the water to the ingredients in making ink, Zuhi Shriyasan. This indeed is considered to be soaking and has a status of the Malach of Elisha, even without manually mixing and kneading the ingredients together. Who is this man? The Omar Rav Yosef, Rebbe. This is the Shita of Rebbe who subscribes to this view. The San is from the Braisa. Echad hanoisenes kemach. If one individual contributes the flour, ve'echad noisenes mayim, and one pours the water into the flour, ha'achron chayiv. This last individual is liable. He's chayiv. He did the malacha of lisha, although he didn't actually mix together and knead the ingredients together. So you see that merely introducing the water with a powder constitutes a malacha of lisha, because it creates that glob, it binds the ingredients together. David Rabbi Yossi Omer, no, ein chayev achi yigabel, unless you actually mix them and knead them together manually. That is not the malacha of lisha. Merely introducing, pouring the ingredients into each other, that is not considered to be lisha. So apparently our Mishnah subscribes to the shita, to the view of Rebbe. So this is Rav Yosef's approach. Our Mishnah is following the shita of Rebbe. Amali Abaye. Perhaps we can differentiate between the two. Rabbi Yossi will differentiate between a case where the kneading process, the manual kneading process, is necessary. It enhances the results significantly. In that case, Rabbi Yossi maintains that the malacha of lisha is not completed unless he manually mixes it together. However, in a case where lisha, where kneading it together manually is not really so crucial, the basic results are achieved simply by mixing, by pouring, by introducing the liquid with the powder. Perhaps in that case, Rabbi Yossi agrees that the malacha of lisha has already been completed merely by introducing the water. And indeed, in our Mishnah, which is discussing diyoi, making of ink, that's something where merely introducing the water to the ingredients already achieves that binding result, that glob formation, and it doesn't really need the additional mixing. Although the additional mixing will improve the mixing up of the ingredients. Definitely, it adds benefit, but the basic results have been achieved even without it. Says the more Amali Abaye. So Abaye challenged Rabbi Yosef's assertion that our Mishnah could only be going according to Rebbe and not Rabbi Yossi, because Rabbi Yossi would require manual kneading. Amali Abaye, perhaps that's not so. But Dilma, Ad can come Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi only maintains his shita, his opinion that manual mixing is required for the malacha of lisha. That's only el bekemach with regard to flour, the var gibulhu, because over there indeed the kneading is very necessary to achieve the end result. Aval diyoi, regarding making of ink, the lav bar gibulhu, over there gibul is not really so necessary. The basic results have been achieved merely by pouring, by introducing the water to the other ingredients. In that case, even according to Rav Yosi, is already chayiv merely by pouring the ingredients into each other. So indeed, our Mishnah, which discusses diyoi, which is lav bar gibelu, which is not something which requires kneading, according to Rav Yosi as well, merely introducing the ingredients to each other, soaking the ingredients in the water, even without manually kneading them, is already considered to be a malach of lisha, according to Rav Yosi. Says the Gemara, but you can't even suggest this. Why? Because we find the Bryce of the Sanya Echadais and Sefer, one who places the ash, and the other fellow comes and contributes the water onto the ash. Ha'achron chayiv. So the last one is chayiv. Divrei Rebbe. This is the shita of Rebbe, who maintains that even pouring the water onto the ingredient, soaking them together, is already considered to be melacha of lisha. Rabbi Yosef Omer, Achi Yigabel, unless he actually kneads and mixes them together, he is not chayiv. So we see an example of an item which is lav bar gibel. Afer ashes doesn't require this additional kneading. Merely by mixing the ingredients together, by soaking the ingredients together without manually mixing it, without manually kneading them with each other, has already achieved the basic results. The ingredients have already bound to each other, already formed a glob. And nevertheless, Rav Yosi tells us, Achi Yigabel, unless he manually kneads and mixes them well together, there is no malach of lisha. So apparently Rav Yosi does not differentiate between different types of items. Says one second, V'dilma, perhaps we can say, my Efer. What does the Brisa mean when it says Efer? It's actually not ashes. It's actually afar, earth, sand. As Rashi explains, this is bar gibel. They would need to mix it properly in order to use it for building cement. So this indeed requires kneading. It is the bar gibelu, and therefore, according to Rav Yosi, the malach is not complete unless there was an actual gibel, a manual kneading that took place. However, in a case where we're talking about something that doesn't require kneading, it is lav bar gibel, like in the case of our Mishnah of diyoi, of ink, merely soaking them together. Perhaps even according to Rav Yosi would be considered to be a malacha. Counters the Gemara about Tanya, but haven't we learned one brayso which says Efer, that the machlekes with Rebbe and Rav Yosi is applicable to ashes, which is lav bar gibel. Vatanya, we have another brayso which says Afar, that the machlekes pertains to earth, which is a bar gibel. So apparently the braysos are coming to include all scenarios, and you cannot suggest to differentiate between the two. Responds the Gemara. Okay, so we have two braysos. However, Midi, Gabi Hadodi Tanya, well, both braysos studied and learned at the same location, which implies that they're coming to include all scenarios, Afar as well as Efer. No, perhaps they were learned at different locations. One was learned in the base measure of Chia, the other one in the base measure of Aishia, and they were both referring to the same scenario of Afar, of earth, which is bar gibel. The brayso which says Efer with an aleph, sometimes the letters aleph and ayin are interchangeable. That brayso too was referring to Afar, which is earth, which is a bar gibel, and therefore certainly there's a machlekes between Rebbe and Rav Yosi. According to Rav Yosi, there's no malacha completed until the Afar, which is a bar gibel, which requires needing to achieve its proper result. Until that happens, there's no malacha of lisha. So in summary, regarding the malacha of lisha, Rav Yosef began the Gemara by telling us that we have a machlekes between Rebbe who holds that merely soaking the ingredients together, which binds them and forms this glob, is considered to be lisha. According to Rav Yosi, it requires manual kneading on top of the soaking. Therefore, the Mishnah, which told us that merely soaking ingredients together is lisha, apparently is found in the shita of Rebbe. According to Abaye, we can differentiate between different types of products. Ordinarily speaking, with something that is a bar gibel, like a flour dough, certainly in that case, manual kneading is required to achieve the proper results. And therefore, according to Rebbe, even soaking them together is shriya, is lisha. According to Rav Yosi, requires the additional lisha, the additional manual kneading, to be considered a malacha of lisha. However, in a case which is lav bar gibel, for instance, the ingredients to make the ink, or ashes mixed with water. There's no real need to do manual kneading there to achieve the basic results. In those cases, there's no machlekes. Says Abaye, everybody agrees. Rav Yossi agrees to Rebbe that merely soaking it together shriya already constitutes the malacha of lisha. Continues the Gemara. Tanar Rabbanan, we learned in the Brayso. Poiskin mayim lagina erev Shabbos. One may dig a little trench on the side of the stream to direct the water over to his garden. Poiskin mayim lagina erev Shabbos. Im chashecha. He may do so on erev Shabbos, very close to Shabbos. Umismales v'hoilechas kol yom kula. Even though the end result will be that the water will flow to his garden and water it throughout the entire Shabbos. That's okay, as long as he did his malacha on erev Shabbos. Continues the Brayso. Umanichen mugmar. One may place burning incense tachas hakelim, underneath the garments. Umizgarmen v'hochen kol yom kula. Although the incense will continue burning and impart fragrance onto the clothing throughout the entire Shabbos, we're not concerned with that. Umanichen gofris. One may place burning sulfur tachas hakelim, underneath the silver vessels. Rashi explains they used to engrave the silver with designs, and then they used to burn the sulfur underneath it, so the engravings will fill with black, with the black from the black smoke coming from the sulfur, and this will enhance its design. So we may do so. We may begin this process. Manichin gofres tachas hakelim. We may begin to do so on erev Shabbos. Although this process will continue on its own throughout the entire Shabbos. Continues the Brayso on a similar vein. This is regarding something which is merely Issa d'Rabbanon. One may place some type of medicine on top of his eye, or dressing on a wound on their Shabbos prior to darkness, although it will continue functioning and providing remedy. So although we know that doing a refuah on Shabbos is asur, for concern that a person might grind the ingredients on Shabbos and do a malacha, so although this is asur on Shabbos, but certainly on erev Shabbos one may place this bandage on his wound, even though the remedy will continue working on Shabbos itself. There's no Issa d'Rabbanan in this case. Concludes the Brayso. Aval, however, in the following case is an Isser. Aval ein nois n'chitim l'seicher shemayim. One may not place wheat into a water mill, which will continue functioning and grinding on Shabbos itself. He might not do so on erev Shabbos unless it completes the grinding process already on erev Shabbos. Says, my timer. This seems to be inconsistent. We began by saying that one is permitted to have his kalim, his utensils, perform malachas on Shabbos. Regarding the mugmar, regarding the gofris, which are contained in a vessel, which is doing malach on Shabbos. And then we conclude an isser regarding a watermill. Why is that? My time, Amar Rabbah. Here there's a specific reason, a unique reason. Amar Rabbah b'nei shmas koil, because it sends forth a loud noise, a loud sound when it is grinding, and this is a zilzal, a degradation of Shabbos. There are two approaches in the Mefarshim, either because the noise itself is a zilzal for Shabbos, or because the public might have a perception that a person is actually performing malach on Shabbos when they hear the sound of the mill. So on account of this reason, it is asur to have the mill functioning throughout Shabbos. You must ensure that the process completes before Shabbos. Amli Rav Yosef, why do you need to resort to a new reason of mashma'as koil? Why don't you opt for a more simple approach? V'lei mamar, why don't you say the following thing? The reason is mishum shrisas kalim, because the person is obligated to have his utensils remain idle on Shabbos and not perform malacha, and therefore the watermill may not function and grind on Shabbos itself. What do we find this Isra Shisa scale in the Sana, as we learned in the Brayso? Regarding everything that I have told you, you should be careful, you should watch, you should take safeguards. L'rabois Shisa scale, The word ubachoil is coming to include. What is it coming to include? Even shvisas kelim, the requirement for one's utensils to remain idle and not perform malach on Shabbos. So this is the source of this din of shvisas kelim. Says Rav Yosef. If so, Elam Rav Yosef, what is the reason indeed for this watermill to be idle on Shabbos? Mishum shvisas kelim. For this specific reason of shvisas kelim, it needs to remain idle and not do malach on Shabbos. Continues the Gemara. The Gemara here is making a blind assumption that when Rav Yosef established the reason for the concluding halacha of this brisa regarding the watermill that is based on the tam of shvisas kelim, apparently the entire brisa subscribes to this svara, to this halacha, and who's the author of this brisa? It is actually Beis Hillel. Why? Explains Rashi, because in the beginning of the brisa we have many leniencies listed. And this is reminiscent to the opinion of Beis Hillel mentioned in our Mishnah earlier on Yadayim Beis, who indeed applies leniencies to this concept of shvisas kelim. Continues the Gemara, V'hashta de Amras. Now that you've suggested and proposed, you've established that Beis Hillel isol shvisas kelim, that Beis Hillel as well subscribes to the shita, to the opinion, to the obligation to have one's kelim remain idle on Shabbos. Shvisas kelim d'oraisa. This is a chiyuv midoraisa, and this brisa, which refers to the halacha of shvisas kelim on account of the isra of the watermill, apparently is Beis Hillel who subscribes to this shita. If so, how are we going to explain the beginning of the brisa, which doesn't seem to follow this halacha? Gafris mugmar, my time is sharu. Why in the case of the gafris and the mugmar, the sulfur and the incense which are burning inside this kli and seem to be performing malacha on Shabbos, why does the brisa, which is the shita of Beis Hillel, who subscribes to shvisas kelim, why does the brisa allow it? Says the Gemara, we must make a distinction between various cases. It's different. It's different whether the kli, the utensil, is performing an active maisa, an active malacha, or merely a passive malacha, which is mutar on Shabbos. According to Beis Hillel, we make a chiluk, a differentiation between the two things. Explains the Gemara. Gafrus and mugmar, my time is shor. What is the reason for the heter mishum delika of it maisa? Because the kli, the utensil, is not actively doing a maisa. It's merely in a passive state. It contains the mugmar and the gafris, which are burning, but the kli itself is in a passive state, and therefore there's no isser of shvisas kelim. Continues the Gemara. Okay, fine. Let's go back to our Mishnah. Unen shel pishtan. What about the bundles of flax which Beis Hillel permit to be put into the oven to heat up and whiten, even if the process would be completed on Shabbos? My time is sharu. Why in that case do they permit? What about shvisas kelim? Says Gemara, there as well, there's no active maisa being done by the oven. Mishmadulik oven maisa. The oven is merely in a passive state. Therefore, according to Beis Hillel, that is mutter. What about the traps mentioned in the Mishnah? Mitzudas chayav v'ifadogim. Certainly there the trap is being triggered by the animal upon entry, and the trap is doing a maisa. It's an active malacha. The covered maisa, my time is sharu. Says Gemara Samnami. We're not speaking about an ordinary trap, which gets triggered and the trap actually catches the prey. We're speaking about unique cases of traps. For instance, hasamnach belechi v'kukri. We're speaking about a hook, a fisherman hook, where the fish itself entraps itself in the hook when it swallows it, but the hook itself is not being active, it's not actively trapping its prey. V'kukri, for instance, another example of a fish trap would be a basket, which is shaped as a funnel, and once the fish goes in, it's only one way. It's a one-way basket, and the fish can't back out anymore. So there too, the avid maisa, the kli, the trap is not actually performing an active maisa malach, and therefore, according to the Hillel, that is mutter. So, according to this state in the Gemara, Beis Hillel agree with the concept of the obligation to be shvisas kelim, to have one's utensils idle on Shabbos, and that is the reason why the watermill may not function on Shabbos. However, that's only regarding a malacha which is an active maisa. But if we're speaking about a passive maisa malacha, like the case of the kli which contains the burning sulfur, or the trap which is merely in an active state. According to the Hillel, there's no Isser Shvisas Kalim. However, according to the Shammai, in any case, there's a halacha, an obligation to allow your utensils to be shavis on Shabbos. They may not perform even a passive malacha. But the Gemara will overturn this. It says the Gemara, "V'hash Damar v'Oishya." Now that Rav Yosha taught us in the name of Rav Asi, Amar Vasi, that Beis Hillel don't subscribe to the Shita at all. They don't agree with the concept of Shvisas Kalim at all. Mantan, who's the Shita, who's the Manda Amar, Shvisas Kalim Deiraisa, who maintains that there's a Chivin or Deiraisa for idling one's utensils, it is strictly Beis Shammai, but like Beis Hillel. If so, Beis Shammai, it's irrelevant whether the Kli is doing an active Maisa or a passive Malacha, Ben Kavod Maisa, Ben Toloi Kavod Maisa, Asr. In either case, there's a Chiv of Shvisas Kalim, and one's utensil may not perform any sort of Malacha, whether passive or active. Beis Hillel, on the other hand, in either case, it's mutter. Afagav Kavod Maisa Shar. Even if the Kli is actually performing an active Maisa Malacha, like in the case of the watermill, it will be mutter, even if the milling concludes on Shabbos itself. If so, who is the Manda Amar of the Braisa that we learned today, which prohibits the watermill from functioning on Shabbos? That is strictly the Shita Beis Shammai, who hold this opinion, who obligate one to be Shavis Kelev on Shabbos. Continues the Gemara. Okay, if the Manda Amar of this Braisa is Beis Shammai, how are you going to explain the beginning of the Braisa, which allows a malacha under certain circumstances? V'hasha da amris, the Beis Shammai, afagav the loy of it ma'isa asur. Even if the kli is not actively doing a ma'isa, it's really in a passive state, it's still asur for the kli to do malacha. If so, what about the first cases in the Braisa? Mugmer b'garfers my time is shoro Beis Shammai. Why does Beis Shammai permit one to have the kli which contains the incense or the sulfur continue functioning and burning on Shabbos, even though the malacha is being performed by its kli on Shabbos? Even though it's a passive malacha, nevertheless, according to Beis Shammai, there's no differentiation between passive and active. So why is it mutter? Says the Gemara, he must be speaking about hasam manach harara. There's no kli whatsoever. There's no kli present. The mugmar, the incense, and the sulfur are actually placed directly on the earth, and they're burning right there in their place. There's no kli involved. Therefore, certainly it's mutter. Continues the Gemara. How is Beis Shammai going to explain the following halachas? Gigis, a barrel which contains the ingredients which are soaking to make the beer. As Rashi explains, the procedure for making beer certainly took longer than 8 days, and inevitably included a Shabbos in the middle. And we know that everybody makes beer. According to Beis Shammai, how is one allowed to soak the ingredients to make beer? In a barrel, in a kli. The soaking is lisha, is a malacha. And since it's in a gigis, in his barrel, his kli is doing a malacha on Shabbos. It says in Mar gigis, vener, a candle burning on Shabbos. According to Beis Shammai, how is that allowed? Ukadera, a pot which is cooking, completing its cooking process on Shabbos. According to Beis Shammai, how is that allowed? Ushfud, a spit which contains the meat on it, and it is lowered into present in a tanner, or an oven. We have a Beferish Mishnah, a Mishnah Daf Yomi, which clearly tells us that is allowed on Shabbos. So, according to Beis Shammai, how are you going to explain this phenomenon? Certainly, these things are mutter. It is common practice to make beer. It's common practice to have a candle burning on Shabbos, actually a mitzvah. It's common practice to have the pot with the food which continues to burn to cook on Shabbos, as we will learn later on in the Masechta, and the shfud, the spit containing the meat inside the oven. My time is shor Beis Shammai. What about shvisas kelim? Says Gemara, must be speaking about the mafkul afkuri, that indeed in those cases he was mafkir, he rendered his kli ownerless, and therefore it is mutter. So the pot, the vat containing the beer ingredients is hefker. It's not his kli. The nair, the kader, the pot, the spit, these are not his kelim. He made them hefker, and therefore there's no isser. There's no obligation for shvisas kelim regarding a kli that's not his. Okay, says the Gemara, So we have two shitas. We have Beis Shammai who holds of Shvisas Kelim, Beis Hillel who doesn't hold of the concept of Shvisas Kelim. If so, Man Tana, who is the Man Amar Lahad Tana Rabbanan to the following brayse, which says, Lo Yisemali Isha Kedera, a woman should not fill up a pot with associates with turmusin, these types of beans which require extensive cooking. She shouldn't do this on Erev Shabbos, and place it in the oven, Erev Shabbos and Chashecha, on Erev Shabbos close to Shabbos, because inevitably it will continue cooking on Shabbos. But if she did so, we apply a knas, a penalty. As a result, L'motzei Shabbos asurim, on Matzah Shabbos, this cooked food is asur b'chdei sheyasu, unless she waits a prescribed time. A sufficient amount of time has to pass, the time that would enable one to do this cooking procedure all over again. The reason for this is that she should not derive benefit from having done an Isra on Shabbos, so she needs to wait b'chdei sheyasu, a sufficient amount of time which is sufficient to actually cook this item anew. A baker should not fill a barrel of water and place in the oven close to Shabbos, and where the cooking will continue on Shabbos. And if he did so, the same halacha Shabbos asurin, it is asur b'chdei sheyas, unless he waits enough time which is sufficient to enable recooking of this water all over again. So he doesn't have no benefit from the Yisr. Says the Gemara, which shita is this? Leima Beis Shammai, v'lei Beis Hillel. Perhaps this is the shita of Beis Shammai that considers this to be an Isser when a person's kli, person's pot, is performing malacha on Shabbos. But this is not shita of Beis Hillel. Says the Gemara, afilu tema Beis Hillel. Even if the mandam of this brayse is Beis Hillel, it will work out. Why? Because although Beis Hillel do not hold of the din of shvisas kelim, but they hold of another gzeira, This is a concern that if one allows the cooking to continue on Shabbos, he might go ahead and approach the coals and stir them to enhance and expedite the cooking process. And stirring coals is a malacha of mavir, of burning a fire. Therefore, there's a precaution the Chacham set in place. Don't place this pot into the oven so close to Shabbos when it will continue cooking on Shabbos, out of concern that the person might approach it and stir the coals. So although Beis Hillel don't agree with the concept of shvisas kelim, the Isser is not, due to the fact that his kli is doing a malacha, but due to the fact that he might himself come to do a malacha. So in summary, there's a machlekes between the Shammai and Beis Hillel regarding shvisas kelim, the obligation to have one's kelim remain idle without doing malacha on Shabbos. According to Beis Shammai, yes, there's an obligation of shvisas kelim. If he is mafkir, if he renders his kli ownerless, certainly in that case it's mutter. According to Beis Hillel, there's no chiv of shvisas kelim. However, the Gemara told us that if the malacha sends forth a loud noise, it is mashmiya koil. That too is asur according to Beis Hillel on account of zilzal of Shabbos. And the Gemara concluded that even according to Beis Hillel, there's a gzeira of shami yachata. A person may not have his pot continue the cooking process on Shabbos, for account of a different precaution of a gzeira of shami yachata, because he might approach the coals and stir them on Shabbos, and certainly that is a malacha de'oraisa, which he is doing, and that is asur. Continues the Gemara, okay, if that's the case, that Beis Hillel subscribed to the gzeira of shami yachata, why in the case of the sulfur and the incense did you say that according to Beis Hillel, one may place the mugmar, the incense, into the kli so close to Shabbos, even though they're continuing to burn on Shabbos? Regarding the gafris as well, the sulfur, one may continue the process on Shabbos. Why? Is there no gzeir of shami chata there? Perhaps they'll go and stir the coals to enhance the burning process. Says the Gemara, there is different. Hasam lo yimachsilu, he will not stir them. The yimachsi, because if he indeed does so, it will ruin the clothing, it will ruin the silver kalim. Salk bu kutra v'kashilu. By stirring the coals, he's going to raise a smoke, and that will go ahead and ruin the clothing that are hovering above the incense. That will ruin the klei chesef, the silver kelim, which are hovering above the sulfur. Therefore, there's no gzera of shamei chata, and it is permitted according to Beis Hillel. What about unin shel pishta nami ligzor? What about the case in the Mishnah where he puts bundles of flax into the oven? According to Beis Hillel, that's permitted. Why is there no gzera shamei chata? Perhaps he'll go stir the coals. Hasam there too, kiven the kashlu zika. Since the draft can harm the bundles, if he opens the door to the oven, the inrush of cold wind can harm the bundles of flax. Therefore, this will dissuade him from doing so. He won't go reveal, he won't go open the door and won't approach the coals. There's no gzera of shamei chata in that case as well. What about semer le'yoyer ligzer? What about the case where he puts the wool into the vat containing the dye? The Mishnah tells us according to Beis Hillel that's permitted. Why is there no gzera that he might go ahead and stir the coals to enhance and expedite the process? Amar Shmuel b'yer akura. The Mishnah is speaking about a case where the vat is removed from the coals, so there's no concern of shamei chata. It's not on the flame. What about the following concern? V'neicha shama megasba. That'll go ahead and stir the content of the vat. As Rashi explains, even if it's off the flame, since it's still hot, stirring it is considered to be a bishul. So are we not concerned about that? It says the Gemara ba'akura v'tucha. We're speaking about that it has two conditions. It's removed from the flame, so there's no concern that it will stir the gechalim. And there's also v'tucha. It is clamped shut. It is smeared shut with clay. So he won't go ahead and open the lid. The smearing of clay calls attention to the Isser, and he will not go ahead and break through it and open it up. He'll realize, hey, it's Shabbos, and I may not do so on Shabbos. Continues the Gemara, now that you've taught us the concept of Gzera Shamei Chata B'Gecholim, that there's a concern, there's a precaution, lest he come to stir the coals. If so, the Gemara provides some guidelines as to when and where this Gzera is applied. Says the Gemara, Hai Kedera Chaisa, this pot which contains raw ingredients, in this case, Shari La Nucha Erev Shabbos Mechashecha B'Tanur. When we place this pot, Erev Shabbos, close to nightfall, close to Shabbos, B'Tanur, in an oven, so that it continues cooking on Shabbos. There's no concern about Shamei Chata in this case. Why? My time. Kiva de lechazi le'urta, because in any case, it won't be fit for consumption at night, since it requires cooking for a long period. It won't be edible until tomorrow in any case. So there's no concern that he'll go and stir the coals. He has no point, no benefit to stir the coals to expedite and enhance the cooking process, since he's going to have to wait till tomorrow regardless. Therefore, says the Gemara, he diverts his attention completely from this pot. He will not come to stir the coals. So raw food is okay. Continues the Gemara, bashal shapir, dummy. If it is bashal, completely cooked, if it is a pot which contains completely cooked food, in this case as well, shapir dummy, it is okay to place it in the oven close to Shabbos, because here as well there's no concern of chitoi. Why would he go stir the coals for food which is completely cooked? However, in a case where it's partially cooked, basha b'loi bashal, indeed it's asr, because in this case we're concerned that he'll want to stir the coals to expedite the cooking, to enable consumption at an earlier point in time. However, says the Gemara, if he throws into this pot which contains partially cooked food, he goes out and tosses into it a gar machaya, a raw piece of meat. In this case, he's revealing his attention. He's being megala his das, that he has no intention of consuming it at an earlier point in time. He's going to have to wait till tomorrow anyways, and therefore there's no concern of shamei chata and shapir dummy. He may indeed place it in the oven close to Shabbos. So, in summary, we have a halacha of shamei chata b'gecholim. One may not have his pot cook on Shabbos, because he might go ahead and stir the coals to expedite the cooking process. But there are various guidelines to this halacha. Let's start with the mugmar begafris, placing the incense or sulfur in the kli and have it continue burning on Shabbos. That is mutter, because there's no concern that he might stir them, because it will raise a smoke which will ruin his garment or utensil. Regarding the unin shel pishtan, the bundles of flax, he may place it close to Shabbos. in the oven, there's no concern of Shamei Chata, because if he were to open the oven, the inrush of cold wind, the draft, will harm the flax, and therefore he will not do so. He may put Sema Liyera, the wool, in the vat to absorb the dye, because in that case we're speaking about a yera which is akura, which is removed from the coals, and it is also clamped shut with clay, so you will not open it to stir it on Shabbos. The Gemara concluded by telling us that regarding cooked food, it depends what scenario we're speaking about. If it's a kedera chaisa, a pot which contains raw food, or even one raw piece of meat, that is mutter, because he's masiach das. He diverts his attention from this pot, and he will not come to cook and to enhance his cooking by stirring the coals. Now the Mefarshim speak out this heter of kedera chaisa, a pot which contains raw ingredients, where there's no isser shamei chata, because he diverts his mind. He knows it won't be edible until tomorrow, so he will not come to stir the coals. There's one exception to this heter, and that is regarding ingredients which require extensive cooking. For instance, those beans mentioned earlier in the Gemara, the associates of turmicin. In that case, there's a real concern that he'll stir the coals, because although it won't be edible until tomorrow, but if they require extensive cooking, he's going to want to expedite the process. And instead of it being ready only tomorrow afternoon or evening, it should be ready in the morning. And therefore there is a concern in that case for Shamei Chata. The Gemara told us that food which is bashal legamrei, that is mutter. There's no isser Shamei Chata, because it doesn't require chitui. The chitui doesn't help it. Regarding an item, food which is partially cooked, bashal, in that case, indeed, there's an isser to place it in an oven close to Shabbos, for concern that he might go ahead and stir the coals to enhance the cooking process, lemaher bishulai. Continues the Gemara, now that you've taught us that kol midi de kosher lezika, any item which can be harmed by the inrush, by the draft of cold air, loy mugalale, a person will not reveal it and expose it to the elements. The Gemara told us that there's no concern that a person will open the oven which contains the bundles of flax. He won't do that to stir the coals, because the draft will harm the flax. If so, says the Gemara, we can conclude from this the following halachas. Hai bisra de gadya, if we have meat of a tender goat, which is sensitive to draft, and the inrush of cold air can harm it. So if the oven contains this bisra de gadya, visharik, and we have another factor in favor, another factor that dissuades the fellow from opening the door to the oven, which is visharik, and the door to the oven is sealed shut with clay. So we have two factors in favor. Shaber dummy. In this case, there's no concern that he might go and open the door and stir the coals, so it's mutter to place this tender goat's meat in the oven close to Shabbos. The barcha v'lisharik. However, if the meat is ram's meat, which is not so sensitive to the indraft, v'loy sharik, and the door to the oven is not sealed shut, so we have two negative factors. Nothing dissuading him from coming and stirring the coals. Asr, in fact, this case is asr. So we have two factors in favor, it's mutter. Two negative factors, it's asr. What about 1 and 1? The gadya, if it's tender goat's meat, where a person is dissuaded from opening the door lest the indraft harm the meat. V'loy sharik, however, the door to the oven is not sealed tight. Or in the case of the barcha, it is meat of a ram which doesn't get harmed by the draft. V'sharik, however, there is one factor in favor, where the door is sealed shut with clay. So in these two cases, we have one factor on both sides of the coin, one positive factor that dissuades him from opening the door, one negative factor. So what is going to be the halach in this case? Is there gzeira shamei chata? We have a machlekes. Rav Ashi shari, Rav Ashi says it's mutter, as a result of simply one positive factor. Rav Yevi b'difti aser, he says it's aser, since there's only one factor that dissuades him. Says Rav Ashi the shari. If so, how is he going to learn the following Mishnah? Vatnam ain't soilin basa. We may not roast meat, and this applies at all types of meat, even the tender meat of a young goat. We may not roast it. Basar batzal, an onion, ubeitza, or an egg, elok deshi yitzolin b'yadayim, unless it fully roasts while it's still Erev Shabbos. So we see that there is a concern even regarding goat's meat. Says Gemara, Hasan the barcha v'lo sharik. Indeed, it's not speaking about tender goat's meat. It's speaking about the meat of a barcha, of a ram. V'lo sharik. In addition, the door to the oven is not sealed shut. So there are two negative factors. There's nothing dissuading him from coming to stir the coals. So in summary, according to this first approach in the Gemara, when we have two factors dissuading him from stirring the coals, it is mutter. When there are two negative factors, all agree that it's asr. The machlekes is when it's one-on-one. Ikadamri, there's another version to this halacha. This version maintains that even if it's only one factor in favor, all agree that it's mutter. When is the machlekes? When there are two negative factors. Says the Gemara, Ikadamri, the gadya, when it's tender goat's meat. In that case, since there's one positive factor, if so, bein sharik, whether the door is sealed, bein lei sharik or not sealed, shavar dami, it's good. There's no gzeira shamichata, since he dissuaded from opening the door to the oven lest he ruin and harm the tender meat. So all agree to this. The barchanami, even if we're speaking about ram's meat, visharik, however, there's one positive factor that the door is sealed. Shavar dami, there too, all agree that it's mutter on account of this one factor. Ki pligi, what is the machlekes? The barcha v'lo sharik. When there are two negative factors, number one, it's ram's meat. Number two, the door is not sealed. The Rav Ashi shari, Rav Yira difti asr. Says Rav Ashi the shari, who allows in all cases, even if there's no positive factors, nothing dissuading him. V'atanan, but haven't we learned? Ain't soilim basar batzal beitza elak teishay tzolim b'yayim. So you see that the basar and beitza need to be fully roasted while it's still day. Apparently, it's asr to be done on Shabbos. Says Gemara, there it's speaking about a unique case. Hassam bebisra gumri. We're speaking about the meat which is directly lying on the coals. Explains Rashi, there's no kisei, there isn't even a covering on the meat to dissuade him from approaching it. So therefore, it's asr. However, in our case, where the meat is contained within something, there's a kisei, there's a covering, or a door to the oven. So that's enough, that's sufficient to distance him from coming to stir the coals. Concludes the Gemara, Amar Avina, Hai karachaya, this raw pumpkin shavar dami, it too can be placed in the oven close to Shabbos, given the kosher zika, since it too is sensitive to the draft. Kibisa the gadi dami, it is equated with the young tender goat's meat, and one will not come to open the door to stir the coals. So in summary, we have two approaches in the Gemara. The first version of the Gemara was that when there are two factors in favor, for instance, it's tender meat of a gdi, the door to the oven is sealed tight. Since we have two dissuading factors, it's mutter. When we have two negative factors, it is barcha, ram's meat, loy sharik, the door is not sealed, all agree that it's asr. The machlekes is in the case where we have one-on-one. It is gdi, which is a positive element. But it's loy sharik, the door is not sealed. There's a machlekes. Or if it's sharik, the door is sealed, which dissuades him from opening it. But it's barcha, it's ram's meat. In that case, there's a machlekes between Rav Ashi, who permits, and Rav Yirmiyah, who prohibits. The second version of the Gemara maintains that if there's merely one factor to dissuade him, it's the basar gdi. Even if it's loy sharik, the door is not sealed, all agree that it's mutter. If it's sharik, it's sealed. Although it's barcha, it's ram's meat, since there's one dissuading factor, the sealed door, all agree that it's mutter. The machlekes is when there are two negative factors. It is barcha, it is ram's meat, which doesn't get harmed by the inrush of cold air, and also the door is not sealed, it is loy sharik. That is the point of the machlekes. According to Rav Ashi, there too it's mutter. According to Rav Yirmiyah, it's asr. And the Gemara concluded that Rav Ashi will agree that it's asr in the case of bisra gumri, meat directly placed on the coals, because there's no kisei, there's no covering, it's not contained within something, and there's nothing to dissuade him from approaching the coals and stirring them. Continues the Gemara. Beishamei oimrim ei moichrin tana rabbanon. Beishamei oimrim lo yimkor adam chafetz l'nachri. One may not sell his item to a non-Jew. V'lo yashilenu, nor may he loan him something. V'lo yilvenu, or lend him something. Rashi explains that the first case she'ela means that the item will be returned to the lender. Yalvenu means that the person who borrows the item returns merely its value. So he may not do so with a non-Jew, or give him a present, on Erev Shabbos close to Shabbos, ella unless there's enough time available for the non-Jew to take the item all the way to his home to arrive at his destination before Shabbos. Why? Because if he carries this item in Rishus Rabbim on Shabbos, it is mechzi kishluchai. Perhaps the public will conclude that this guy is an emissary. He was sent by the Jew to carry this item, and that is not mutar on Shabbos. Therefore, we must ensure that he arrives at his destination before Shabbos. That's not necessary. It is enough it is enough that he reaches the first house in the city, within the wall, because he could place the item there. Therefore, it's not necessary that he reach all the way to his final destination. Rabbi Kiva Omer, it's enough that he leaves the home of the Jew before Shabbos. That is mutter, as long as he doesn't leave on Shabbos, because if he leaves on Shabbos, it appears as though they did business, they struck a deal on Shabbos itself, and that's not mutter. So as long as he leaves before Shabbos, that's enough. Amar Reiser Yehuda, this statement of Rabbi Kiva is actual explanation, an elucidation of the Shita Beis Hillel. Heinein divrei Rabbi Kiva, heinein divrei Beis Hillel. Rabbi Kiva is not stating his own opinion, but explaining the Shita Beis Hillel. Lo yibar Rabbi Kiva ela lafarish divrei Beis Hillel. Is explaining the Shita Beis Hillel. They're very lenient. They maintain that as long as he leaves the home of the Yid before Shabbos, it is mutter. Tana Rabbanan. On a similar topic, one may not sell his chametz to a non-Jew before Pesach, unless he knows for certain that the chametz will be totally consumed before Pesach. A person must make sure that his chametz item is not in the world, doesn't exist, is not present on Pesach anywhere in the world, even in the possession of a non-Jew. So this is similar to Beis Shammai's concept mentioned earlier, Shvisas Kalim, that not only may he not do malacha on Shabbos, even his utensils may not do malacha. This is similar to what we just said, that he might not hand over an item to a non-Jew, which will be carried on Shabbos. So even though he's not doing a malacha, his item is being carried on Shabbos, that too is not permitted. Here too, on a similar vein, closely related topic, a person's chametz, the object, the item, the chayfetz of chametz, cannot be present anywhere in the world on Pesach. So even if he sells it to a guy, he must make sure that it will be consumed before Pesach. Beis Shammai. Beis Hillel, no, that's not necessary. As long as he can still eat the chametz, even on Erev Pesach, he may sell to a non-Jew. As long as the chametz is not in the Jew's possession, it's okay. We're not concerned about the object of chametz. Rabbi Omer, kutach habavli, this dip, which contained pieces of chametz, kutach, which was consumed very slowly, and it took a long time for it to be completed. Also, limkar, it may not be sold lamed yoyim, even 30 days before Pesach, koydem Pesach, because since it takes a while for it to be consumed, therefore, even at the point of 30 days before Pesach, he may not sell to the goy for fear that it might be present in the goy's possession on Pesach. Now, what is the shear of 30 days? Rashi explains that 30 days is the point in time where they begin being doir shilchas HaPesach, they inquire and they study. They prepare themselves for Pesach, and therefore chala asharas Pesach halav. It is chal, it is applied to him, the ashara, the requirement to safeguard, to prepare properly, to ensure that there's no yisurim going to take place on Pesach. And therefore, from 30 days on, he must make sure that his chametz will not be found anywhere in the world during Pesach. So, in summary, we learned today, we began with the Malach of Lisha. What constitutes the Malach of Lisha? According to Rebbe, merely soaking the ingredients together. According to Rav Yesi, we require manual kneading, manual mixing of the ingredients for the completion of the Malach of Lisha. So this was Rav Yesi's approach. According to Abaye, it depends what we're speaking about. We're speaking about something which is bar gibel, like a dough with flour. Indeed, Rav Yesi maintains that unless he did lisha, manual kneading, it is not the melacha of lisha. However, with regard to something which is lav bar gibel, something which doesn't really require the manual kneading to achieve its desired effect, in that case, all agree that merely soaking the ingredients together, shriya, is sufficient for the melacha of lisha. The Gemara preceding told us regarding the halacha of shisas kelim, according to Beis Shammai, indeed, there's an obligation to have one's kelim idle on Shabbos from melacha. If the keli is not his, if it's hefker, surely it's mutter. According to Beis Hillel, there's no obligation of Shisas Kalim. However, if there's a noise emanating from, for instance, the watermill, that is asr because it's a zilzal as a result of the hashmas koil. The Gemara concluded that even according to Beisila, there's a nugzer shamiyachate, that a person might not place the food in the oven so close to Shabbos for fear that he might approach the coals and stir them to expedite the cooking process. When is the halacha of shamiyachate applicable? It's only when there's a real concern to that effect. But otherwise, there's no isser. For instance, the mugmar begafres, the incense and the sulfur, there's no concern that will stir the coals because the kutra, the smoke that rises, will ruin the items. Regarding pishtan as well, the bundles of flax in the oven, he won't open the oven because the indrap will ruin, the inrush of cold air will ruin the flax. He's allowed to leave the tzemer and the yora to be dyed because we're speaking about a vat which is off the flame and it is sealed tight. It is sealed with clay, and therefore he will not come to stir it and enhance the dyeing process. The Gemara concluded which type of food has shamei. So if it's a kedera, a pot which contains raw ingredients, or even one piece of raw meat, in that case he's mesiach das from it. He doesn't expect it to be ready too soon. Therefore, he will not come to cook, to stir the coals. We learned one exception regarding beans which require extensive cooking. In that case, even when they're raw, he will come to stir the coals. Food which is bashal legamri, fully cooked, it doesn't require chitoy, and therefore there's no gzera shemechata. It's only food which is bashal, partially cooked. In that case, we're concerned that will stir the coals to enhance and expedite the cooking process. The Gemara told us that in certain cases, there's no Issa Shemechata. We have two versions in the Gemara. According to the first approach in the Gemara, when it is the meat of a tender goat, and we have another factor in favor, that the door to the oven is sealed tight with clay, we have two positive factors that dissuade him from approaching the coals. It is mutter. When there are two negative factors, it is meat of a barch of a ram which doesn't get affected and harmed by the indraft. In addition, the door is not sharik, it's not sealed tight. All agree that it's asr on account of shamiyachate. The machlekes between Rav Ashi and Rav Yirmiyah is when we have one factor in favor. When it is meat of igdi, but it is loy sharik, it's not sealed tight. Or it is sealed tight, sharik, and it is meat of a barcha, of a ram. According to Rav Ashi, it's mutter. According to Rav Yirmiyah, it's asr. According to the second version of the Gemara, all agree that merely one factor that dissuades him from approaching and stirring the coals is sufficient to be matter. For instance, if it's the meat of a tender goat, even though it's loy sharik, not sealed tight, it's mutter. On the reverse, it is sharik, sealed tight, but it is meat of a ram, all agree that it's mutter. The machlekes is when there are two negative factors. For instance, meat of a ram, and the door is not sealed tight. According to Rav Ashi, it's mutter. According to Rav Yirmiyah, it's asr. And the Gemara concluded that according to Rav Ashi, in a case where the bisra is agumri, directly lying on the coals, it is asr on account of shema yichat. The Gemara concluded with some halachas where there's machlekes with Shammai Hillel. According to Shammai, one may not sell or hand an item to a guy unless we know he'll arrive at his destination before Shabbos. According to Hillel, it's not necessary as long as he leaves prior to Shabbos. And then Gemara concluded a similar halacha regarding chametz. According to Hillel, one may sell his chametz at any time as long as he takes it out of his possession before Pesach. According to Shammai, one must ensure that the cheftza, the item of chametz, is not present anywhere in the world during Pesach.